Welcome to Cali's Sleepless Horror. Let's listen to horror stories to fall asleep with gentle rain sounds. I remember the morning the guest arrived because nothing about it felt unusual. It was a cold stretch in early January in rural Pennsylvania, the kind where the air sits heavy and flat and every sound carries farther than it should. I had been running my small roadside motel for nearly 12 years by then, so I had seen every type of traveler. But something about that morning felt quietly off, like the world was holding its breath even though I couldn't explain why. The man walked in around 10:30. He carried no bags, no suitcase, not even a backpack. Just a dark coat that looked too thin for the weather. He slid his ID across the counter and paid for 3 nights in cash. Nothing extraordinary, yet there was a stillness in the way he moved, as if he were conserving energy the way injured animals do. I didn't ask questions. Motels like mine stay alive by letting people keep their privacy. But I remember watching him walk down the hall to room 6 and noticing that he never once looked back. Most guests come and go, opening and closing their doors, leaving their lights on, moving around the room. Even the quiet ones make some kind of presence known. Room 6 stayed unnervingly silent. I didn't hear the faucet. I didn't hear the heater kicking on. I didn't hear the scrape of a chair or the shuffle of clothing. Nothing. It was like renting a room to a shadow. The second night, I started paying attention. The temperature had dropped into the single digits, and I was doing my nightly check to make sure the pipes wouldn't freeze. I tapped lightly on the door of room 6. Not to intrude, just enough to let the guest know someone was nearby in case something needed attention. No steps. No reply. No acknowledgement. Just the thick, padded quiet of an occupied space that somehow felt empty. I convinced myself it was nothing. Some people travel for silence. Some want to be left alone. But when the third morning came and went with no movement, no request for fresh towels, no sign of life, an uneasy feeling kept tightening in my chest. By late afternoon, the uneasiness grew into something heavier. A car pulled into the lot, a family looking for 2 rooms. I walked them down the hallway past room 6, and for the first time I noticed a faint smell seeping into the air. Not rotten, not chemical, just stale, like clothing that had been shut in a closet too long. I tried to ignore it. I told myself old buildings breathe in strange ways, especially in winter. But the truth was simpler. Something was wrong in that room. I told myself I would check on him the next morning if he still hadn't left. I barely slept. Every sound from the hallway made my heart jump even though there was no reason to react like that. It was almost as if my instincts had already accepted something my mind wasn't ready to acknowledge. The next morning, I knocked again on the door of room 6. 3 gentle taps. Nothing. I waited, pressed my ear against the door. Nothing. The silence had weight to it, like it was pushing outward instead of settling inside. That was the moment I realized I had no choice but to enter. Legally, after 48 hours of no response, I could conduct a wellness check. But it wasn't legality pulling me forward. It was dread. The door creaked when I unlocked it. The room was dim because the curtains were still drawn, but I could see enough. The man was sitting upright in the chair by the window, facing the parking lot. His coat was still on. His hands were folded neatly in his lap. His eyes were open, and he was perfectly, horribly still. At first, I thought he had simply fallen asleep sitting up. But there was something unsettling about the posture. People don't sit that straight unless they're posing for a picture or forcing themselves not to move. I stepped closer and reached for his wrist, hoping, praying, to find even the faintest pulse. His skin was icy cold. I backed away, stumbling, reaching for my phone. My fingers kept slipping because my hands were shaking so violently. I managed to call emergency services, my voice sounding foreign as I gave the address and room number. They told me to wait outside. I didn't want to stay in the room anyway. Something about it felt wrong, as if whatever had taken hold of him was still lingering. The paramedics arrived first, then the county sheriff. They moved around the room with quiet efficiency. I watched from the doorway, feeling useless, feeling exposed. After several minutes, one of the paramedics stepped out and motioned to the sheriff. The 2 of them spoke in low voices. Then the sheriff turned to me. He asked how long the man had been staying. I told him. He asked if anyone had visited or if he had left the room. I told him no. He asked if I had touched anything. I told him only the door handle and the man's wrist. The sheriff nodded and walked back inside with a strange expression. I stood in the hallway, my breathing uneven. The cold from outside crept in each time someone came or went, but the chill twisting through me wasn't from the weather. Something was deeply wrong, and everyone felt it even if no one said so. When the sheriff called me back in, he pointed at the man's hands. His fingernails were spotless, and the faint layer of dust on the desk beside him showed no disturbance. It was as if he had not moved from that exact position since entering the room. The garbage bin was empty, the bed untouched, the bathroom unused. No water spots in the sink, the shower curtain perfectly straight. No sign he had eaten, drunk, slept, or even shifted his weight. The paramedic estimated the man had been dead for at least 24 hours. 24 hours. I had knocked on his door that morning. I had seen the silhouette through the curtains the day before when I checked the heaters. I had felt someone in that room. But according to the paramedic, the man had already been gone. They removed the body that afternoon. The sheriff asked routine questions, then left. I stood alone in the hallway long after, staring at the door of room 6, trying to make sense of the impossible timeline. That night, reviewing the security footage, I noticed something I haven't told anyone. But the cameras covering the parking lot never recorded him arriving. I replayed the footage until my eyes ached, but the truth didn't change. The man never appeared on any camera outside. No arrival. No vehicle. No crossing the lot. It was as if he walked in from nowhere, already knowing my name, already knowing which room he would take. I kept room 6 closed for days, telling guests it needed maintenance. Something in that space felt warped, like the air itself held a memory I couldn't shake. Each time I passed the door, I felt the same weight in my chest, the same pressure, the same awareness of someone who shouldn't be there. When I reopened it, the first guest slept without complaint. Room SAX's door stood open by an inch. The room was empty, but the chair by the window was angled slightly differently. And on the desk, in a thin layer of dust too new to exist, were 2 faint handprints. Folded. Motionless. I brushed my fingers across them. The dust moved too easily, like it hadn't been touched by anything real. I left the room, locked the door, and told myself it was nothing. But the next morning, the door was open again. And behind the curtain, the same silhouette waited in the same impossible stillness, as if the guest who never moved had returned to finish whatever he started. I need to tell someone about what happened at the riverside in last winter, because I can't sleep anymore, and I think I'm losing my mind trying to make sense of it. I was working the night shift at this small motel off Route 9 in upstate New York. It wasn't much, just 20 rooms spread across 2 floors, the kind of place where truckers crash for a few hours or families stop when they're too tired to drive another mile. The pay was terrible, but it was quiet, and after my divorce, quiet was exactly what I needed. It was a Wednesday in February when he checked in. I remember because Wednesdays were always dead, and the cold that week was the kind that gets into your bones and stays there. The guy walked up to the desk around 11 at night, didn't say much, just asked for a room on the 2nd floor. He was maybe 50, average height, wearing a dark jacket that looked expensive. His face was forgettable, the kind you'd pass on the street and not remember 5 minutes later. He paid cash, didn't want a receipt, and when I handed him the key to room 214, his fingers were ice cold. That should have been it. Another faceless guest in an endless parade of them. But around 2 in the morning, I noticed something on the security monitor we kept behind the desk. The camera covering the 2nd floor hallway showed the door to 214 standing open. Not wide open, just cracked, like someone had stepped out and forgotten to pull it shut. I watched for maybe 10 minutes, thinking he'd come back and close it, but nothing happened. The hallway just sat there, empty and gray in the camera's night vision, that door hanging open like a mouth. I didn't want to go up there. Something about it felt wrong, but I couldn't just leave it. What if someone was sick? What if there was a problem? I grabbed the master key and took the stairs, my footsteps echoing too loud in the concrete stairwell. The 2nd floor smelled like old carpet and the lemon cleaner housekeeping used. Room 214 was at the far end, and as I got closer, I could see that thin line of darkness where the door hadn't latched. I knocked, called out that it was front desk. No answer. I pushed the door open slowly, reaching for the light switch, and that's when I saw him. He was sitting in the chair by the window, completely still, facing the parking lot. The curtains were open, and the orange glow from the streetlight outside lit him up just enough that I could see his profile. He was wearing the same jacket. His hands were resting on the arms of the chair, and he wasn't moving at all. Not breathing hard, not shifting his weight, nothing. Just sitting there like a statue. I said his name, the one from the registration card. Nothing. I stepped into the room, my heart starting to hammer, and asked if he was all right. Still nothing. I moved closer, close enough to see that his eyes were open, staring out at the parking lot where a single pickup truck sat under the light. His skin looked waxy, and I couldn't tell if his chest was moving. That's when I panicked and backed out, pulling the door shut, my hands shaking so bad I could barely hold the master key. I went downstairs and called the police, told them I had a guest who might be dead or in some kind of medical crisis. I wasn't sure. They said they'd send someone. 2 officers showed up maybe 15 minutes later. I led them upstairs, explained what I'd seen, and one of them knocked hard on the door, announced police, the whole routine. No answer. They used my key to go in, and I stayed in the hallway, watching through the open door. The chair by the window was empty. The room was empty. They checked the bathroom, looked in the closet, under the bed. Nothing. No luggage, no personal items, no sign anyone had been there at all except the bed was slightly wrinkled, like someone had sat on it. One of the officers turned to me and asked if I was sure about what I'd seen, and the way he said it made me feel insane. I told them yes, I was sure. He'd been sitting right there in that chair not 20 minutes ago. They searched the whole floor, checked every room, looked in the stairwells and the utility closets. The guest was gone. Completely gone. And here's the thing that still makes my skin crawl. The registration card I'd filled out for room 214. The one with his name and the car license plate I'd written down. It was blank when I went to show the police. Just blank white paper in the slot for that room, like no one had ever checked in at all. They asked if I'd been drinking. Asked if I was on any medications. I wasn't. I was stone sober and wide awake, and I know what I saw. But they couldn't find anything, so eventually they left. And I was alone in that motel again with the security monitor showing that empty hallway and that closed door to room 214. I watched the footage back, rewound to when he checked in. The timestamp was there, 11:03 p.m., but the lobby was empty on the screen. No one walking up to the desk. No one at all. Just me standing there alone, apparently talking to nobody and handing a key to the air. I quit 2 days later. Told my boss I had a family emergency and never went back. But sometimes late at night when I can't sleep, I think about that chair by the window and the way he sat so perfectly still. And I wonder if he was ever really there at all, or if something else was sitting in that room, wearing his shape, waiting for me to get close enough to see that whatever it wasn't breathing, wasn't blinking, wasn't human. And I wonder if it's still there, sitting in that chair in room 214, waiting for the next person to notice the door standing open. Story 2. The Guest Who Didn't Move. I managed a bed and breakfast in coastal Maine for 3 years, and I thought I'd seen everything. Difficult guests, strange requests, people who'd show up at odd hours with even odder stories. But nothing prepared me for the man in room 7, and what I realized about him on his 3rd night staying with us. The harbor view was a converted Victorian mansion, 8 guest rooms, all decorated with antiques and floral wallpaper that my wife spent months choosing. We catered to tourists mostly, people coming to see the lighthouses and eat lobster, and pretend they lived in a simpler time. October was our busiest season, leaf peepers and Halloween enthusiasts filling every room. But this happened in late November, after the crowds thinned and the cold Atlantic wind started keeping people away. He arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, no reservation, just walked in asking if we had availability. I remember thinking he looked tired, the kind of exhaustion that lives behind your eyes and never quite goes away. Maybe 40 years old, thin, wearing a gray sweater and jeans. He said his name was Michael Torrance, and that he needed a quiet place to stay for a few days, maybe a week. His voice was soft, polite. He paid for 3 nights up front in cash, and asked for a room away from the stairs. I gave him room 7, top floor, corner room with a view of the harbor. That first night passed without incident. I saw him once, coming down for the continental breakfast we set out each morning. He took a muffin and coffee, nodded politely, and went back upstairs. My wife mentioned she'd heard footsteps from his room throughout the night, slow and deliberate, like someone pacing. Old houses make noise though, and guests have insomnia. We didn't think much of it. The second night, things started feeling off. I was doing my evening rounds, checking that all the common areas were locked up when I passed by room 7. The door was closed, but I could hear something from inside. Not footsteps this time. Just this low, steady sound, almost like humming, but not quite. It was rhythmic, constant, and it made the hair on my arms stand up for reasons I couldn't explain. I stood there in the hallway for probably 5 minutes, just listening, trying to figure out what I was hearing. Eventually I convinced myself it was the heating system, or maybe he was listening to music, and I went to bed. The third night is when I couldn't ignore it anymore. Around midnight, my wife woke me up, shaking my shoulder and whispering that something was wrong upstairs. She'd gotten up to use the bathroom and heard that sound again, that low humming, and it was louder now, resonating through the walls and floor. We both crept upstairs in our bathrobes, moving quietly on the old wooden steps, and the closer we got to room 7, the clearer it became. It wasn't humming, it was breathing. Deep, slow, mechanical breathing, like someone using a ventilator, but with this wet, rattling quality underneath. I knocked on his door, called out Mr. Torrance's name. The breathing stopped immediately, cut off like someone had flipped a switch, and the silence that followed was somehow worse. My wife grabbed my arm, her fingernails digging in, and I could feel her shaking. I knocked again, louder this time, asked if everything was all right. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then I heard footsteps, those same slow, deliberate footsteps, moving toward the door. The door opened maybe 6 inches, and Michael Torrance stood there in the gap, fully dressed in the same clothes from when he'd checked in. His face was in shadow, backlit by the lamp in his room, but I could see his eyes, and they were too bright, too awake for someone who should have been sleeping. He said everything was fine, he apologized for the noise, said he'd been having nightmares, and must have been breathing strangely in his sleep. His voice was still soft and polite, but there was something flat about it now, like he was reading from a script. I told him it was all right, asked if he needed anything, and he said no, he was perfectly comfortable, and then he closed the door. My wife and I went back downstairs, and she wanted to call the police, said something was seriously wrong with that man. But what would I tell them? That a guest was breathing too loudly? That he gave me a bad feeling? We decided to wait until morning, and if he seemed off, we'd ask him to leave. I barely slept. Every sound in that old house seemed amplified, and I kept thinking about the way he'd stood in that doorway, perfectly still except for his mouth moving when he spoke. Around 4 in the morning, I gave up on sleep and went to my office on the first floor, thinking I'd do some paperwork to distract myself. That's when I passed the front window and saw him. Story 3. The Guest Who Didn't Move. I was a housekeeper at the Grand Californian Hotel in Anaheim for 6 years before I quit. And I need to tell someone what I saw in room 842, because it still follows me, even now, 2 years later, and I think I'm the only person who knows the truth about what happened there. The Grand Californian was luxury, the kind of place where families dropped thousands for a weekend near the parks, where every surface gleamed and every guest expected perfection. I took pride in my work, made beds so tight you could bounce a quarter off them, made sure every room was spotless. I worked the morning shift, 7 to 3, doing my assigned floor, usually the 8th. 14 rooms, 8 hours, with a 30-minute lunch break. The work was hard but steady, and I needed steady after my son's father left. It was a Thursday in March when I first noticed something wrong with room 842. I'd knocked 3 times, called out housekeeping like always, waited the full 30 seconds like they trained us, then used my key card to enter. The room was dark, curtains drawn tight, even though it was 10 in the morning. I hit the light switch by the door, and that's when I saw him. A man was sitting in the armchair by the window, facing away from me, toward those closed curtains. He was completely still, wearing what looked like a dark suit, his hands resting on the chair arms. I apologized immediately, said I thought the room was empty, started backing out. He didn't respond, didn't turn around, didn't say anything. I figured maybe he was deaf or wearing headphones, so I said it louder, and still nothing. Just that absolute stillness. I left quickly, hung the Do Not Disturb sign back on the door, marked the room as occupied on my sheet. My supervisor asked why I hadn't cleaned it, and I explained the guest was inside. She checked the system and frowned, said the room was registered to a David Marsh, checked in 3 days ago for a week-long stay, but there was a note that he'd never picked up his park tickets from the concierge and hadn't been seen using any hotel amenities. She said to try again tomorrow. Friday morning, same thing. I knocked, announced myself, waited, used my card. The room was dark again, curtains closed, and he was sitting in that same chair in that same position. I could see the back of his head, dark hair, the shoulders of his suit jacket. This time I didn't go all the way in, just called from the doorway, asked if he wanted his room cleaned. Nothing. Not even a twitch. I closed the door and told my supervisor. She said some guests were just weird, wanted privacy. As long as he wasn't complaining about the room not being serviced, we should leave it alone. Saturday I tried one more time. Knocked, waited, entered. Dark room. Closed curtains. Man in the chair. But this time I noticed something that made my stomach clench. The angle of his head was exactly the same. The position of his hands on the chair arms was exactly the same. Even the way his shoulders sat looked identical to the previous 2 days, like someone had paused a video. I stood there in the doorway, my cleaning cart behind me, just staring at him, and I realized I couldn't see him breathing. No rise and fall of his back. No movement at all. I should have called someone right then. Should have backed out and gotten security. But instead I heard myself saying his name, David Marsh, are you okay? And I took 3 steps into the room. Close enough now to see that his suit was expensive looking, charcoal gray, perfectly pressed. Close enough to smell something faint and chemical, like formaldehyde mixed with air freshener. And that's when I saw his hand. His right hand on the chair arm had this waxy quality to the skin, and the fingernails were too long, curved and yellowed, and there was something dark underneath them, like dried blood or dirt. I stopped moving. My heart was slamming in my chest, and every instinct was screaming at me to get out, but I was frozen, staring at that hand, and then I heard it. A creak. Just the smallest sound, like leather stretching or joints popping, and his head started to turn. Slowly, so slowly, rotating toward me, and I didn't wait to see his face. I ran. Dropped my cleaning cart right there in the hallway, ran to the elevator, went straight to my supervisor's office, and told her something was seriously wrong in that room. That man needed help or police or something. The bed was made and used. The bathroom was clean. There was no sign anyone had been staying there at all. Security checked the keycard logs and said David Marsh's card hadn't been used to enter the room since check-in 3 days ago. Not once, meaning either he'd left and never come back or he'd been inside the whole time without leaving. They asked if I was feeling all right. Asked if I'd been sleeping enough. My supervisor suggested I take the rest of the day off, said maybe I'd been working too hard. I tried to explain what I'd seen 3 days in a row, the same position, the hand, the smell, but I could see in their faces they thought I was losing it. One of the security guards muttered something about drugs, and my supervisor shot him a look but didn't disagree. I went home. Couldn't sleep that night. Kept seeing that hand, those fingernails. Sunday I called in sick. Monday too. But Tuesday I needed the paycheck, so I went back. My supervisor had reassigned me to the 6th floor, said maybe a change would be good. I didn't argue, but during my lunch break, I couldn't help myself. I took the service elevator to 8, walked down the hall to room 842. The Do Not Disturb sign was on the door. I stood there staring at it, and I noticed the edge of the door didn't quite meet the frame. It was open, just a crack, maybe a 1/4 inch, like someone had closed it, but it hadn't latched. I could see darkness through that crack. I put my ear close and listened. At first, nothing. Then I heard breathing. Deep and slow and wet, like someone with lungs full of fluid, and underneath it, that same creaking sound, like something moving that shouldn't be able to move. I stepped back fast, and as I did, I saw something through that crack. A sliver of the room's interior. And in that sliver, I could see the chair by the window. Someone was sitting in it. Same position. Same dark suit. But the angle was wrong now. The head was turned, facing the door. Facing me. And even though I could only see a fraction of the room through that crack, I knew somehow that whatever was sitting in that chair was looking directly at me through the darkness. And it wasn't David Marsh, and maybe it never had been. I left the hotel that day and never went back. Didn't give notice, didn't collect my last paycheck, just walked out and kept walking. I found work at a different hotel across town, smaller, cheaper, but I don't care. Because sometimes late at night, I dream about that room, and in my dreams, I open the door all the way, and I see what's sitting in that chair, and I see its face, and it's not a face at all, just something wearing the shape of one. And in my dreams, it stands up slowly from that chair, joints creaking, and it walks toward me with those 2 long fingernails reaching out. and I wake up gasping, checking the locks on my doors, knowing that someday I'm going to be staying in a hotel somewhere, and I'm going to open the curtains, and I'm going to see that dark figure sitting in the chair, waiting for me, perfectly still. Because whatever was in room 842, I think it knew I saw it, and I think it's been looking for me ever since. I worked front desk at a budget motel outside Tucson, Arizona for 2 years, the kind of place where people paid by the week and nobody asked questions. It wasn't glamorous, but I needed the job after my accident left me with medical bills I couldn't pay, and the owner didn't care that I walked with a limp now. The Desert Star Motel, 40 units arranged in a horseshoe around a parking lot with a dead pool nobody had filled in a decade. Most of our guests were construction workers, people down on their luck, the occasional tourist who took a wrong turn and settled for cheap. I learned not to get involved in their lives, not to wonder about the stories behind the tired eyes and worn suitcases. Check them in, check them out, mind your business. That worked fine until Martin Hess showed up in August, during the worst heat wave I'd ever experienced, when the thermometer hit 115 and the air felt like breathing through a furnace. He walked in around 9 at night, no car that I could see, just appeared at the desk like he'd materialized from the shimmering heat outside. Tall guy, maybe 6'2", skinny in a way that looked wrong, like he'd lost weight recently and his clothes hadn't caught up. He was wearing a button-down shirt and slacks despite the heat, and his skin had this pale, grayish quality that made me think of people who'd been sick for a long time. He asked for a room for a month, paid cash up front, for $100 bills that were crisp and new like they'd come straight from a bank. I gave him room 23, ground floor, middle of the horseshoe. He took the key without a word, no thank you, no small talk, and walked out. I watched him through the office window as he crossed the parking lot, and his gait was strange, stiff and mechanical, like he had to think about each step. He let himself into 23, and the door closed behind him, and that was that. For the first week, I barely saw him. His truck, an old Ford pickup that appeared in the lot the next morning, never moved. The curtains in room 23 stayed closed day and night. I'd see his light on sometimes when I did my midnight walks around the property, just a faint glow through the heavy drapes. The cleaning staff said he'd put out the Do Not Disturb sign and never took it down. A week became 2 weeks, then 3, and the maids were complaining that his room must be getting disgusting, but he'd paid for the month, and as long as he wasn't causing problems, the owner said to leave him alone. The thing that started bothering me was how still everything was around room 23. The rooms on either side had guests who came and went, normal activity, but 23 was like a dead zone. No sounds ever came from inside. No TV noise, no shower running, no footsteps. Nothing. And his truck never moved from its spot, slowly accumulating dust and dead bugs on the windshield until you could barely see through it. 3 weeks in, the guest in room 22 complained about a smell. Said something was wrong next door, maybe a sewage problem, and it was seeping through the shared wall. I told maintenance to check it out, and Carlos, our handyman, went over and knocked on 23. No answer. He knocked louder, announced himself. Still nothing. He came back to the office and said we needed to do a wellness check. That smell wasn't sewage. It was something dead. Maybe the guy had died in there and nobody knew. We called the police. 2 officers showed up, and I led them to room 23 with my master key, my hands shaking because I'd been smelling it too by then, that sweet sick odor of decay that clung to the back of your throat. One of the cops knocked hard, identified himself as police, said we were coming in. He used my key, pushed the door open, and we all stepped back from the wave of heat and stench that rolled out. The room was an oven, had to be 120 degrees inside, and dark except for the light from the doorway. The cop clicked on his flashlight, swept it around, and that's when we saw Martin Hess. He was sitting in the chair by the small table, facing the wall, completely motionless. The cop called out to him, no response. Called louder. Nothing. He approached slowly, and I stayed in the doorway, watching as the flashlight beam hit Martin Hess from behind. The detective asked me questions about Martin Hess, how long he'd been here, had I noticed anything strange, and I told him everything, the cash payment, never leaving the room, the truck that never moved. They evacuated the rooms on either side of 23, put up police tape, told me to keep everyone away. A white van showed up an hour later, people in hazmat suits, and they went into room 23. They were in there for a long time. When they finally brought him out on a stretcher, he was strapped down and covered in a sheet, but I could see the shape of him, and he was still in that sitting position, like his body had locked that way and wouldn't unbend. The detective told me they'd be in touch, took copies of all my records on Martin Hess, and left. The room was sealed, tagged as a biohazard, and a cleanup crew came 2 days later in full protective gear. They removed everything, the furniture, the carpet, even cut out sections of the drywall. I asked one of them what they'd found in there, and he looked at me for a long moment before saying he'd never seen anything like it, that the chair where the guy had been sitting had actually fused to his body in places, flesh grown into fabric, and would like he'd been there so long he'd started merging with it. I did some digging after that, called the detective, asked what happened to Martin Hess. He was quiet on the phone, then said the man had been transported to a medical facility and was being kept under observation, that his condition was being studied. I asked if he was going to live, and the detective said that was complicated, that technically Martin Hess should have been dead weeks ago, that a human body couldn't survive what it had gone through, but he was still breathing, still showing brain activity, still existing in some state between life and death that nobody could explain. Then the detective said something that still keeps me up at night. He said when they'd finally examined Martin Hess closely at the hospital, they'd found his eyes were open behind his eyelids, and they were moving, tracking things that weren't there, and when they tried to close them, they wouldn't close, just kept staring at something only he could see. I quit the Desert Star 2 months later, couldn't work there anymore knowing that room 23 existed, that Martin Hess had sat in that chair for 3 weeks in the suffocating heat, decomposing alive, staring at that wall, and we'd all walked past his door every day not knowing. The motel owner renovated the room, knew everything, and rented it out again like nothing happened. But sometimes I drive past there late at night, and I look at room 23, and I swear I can see a figure in the window, sitting perfectly still in the darkness, and I wonder if some part of Martin Hess is still there, still trapped in that chair, still staring at that wall, existing in that horrible space between living and dying. And I wonder what he was looking at all those weeks, what kept him locked in that position, unable to move or speak or die, and whether he's still looking at it now, wherever they're keeping him, still sitting, still staring, still waiting for something none of us can see.